I used to think betrayal would feel like an explosion, loud, violent, impossible to miss. But the truth is, it's quieter than that. It creeps in like a draft through a cracked window, subtle enough that you almost convince yourself it's nothing. Until one day, you wake up and everything you built is gone. That morning began like any other. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the city outside was just waking, traffic murmuring, sunlight stretching across the curtains. I was supposed to meet my fiancé Ethan at his apartment to finalize plans for the wedding venue. We'd been engaged for 8 months, and I spent every one of them stitching together the details of a perfect future. The venue, the dress, the guest list, all the pieces of a life I believed was waiting for me. Ethan was successful, charming, and meticulous, the kind of man people described as a catch. He was the man who knew how to make anyone feel small next to his confidence, and I had loved that about him once. Loved how he commanded a room, how he made me feel chosen. My best friend Claire used to tease me about it. "You two are disgustingly perfect," she said once, laughing. I didn't know that perfection was already rotting beneath the surface. The key was still in my bag when I reached his door. We trusted each other enough to share everything, or at least, I thought we did. I wasn't planning to use it. I was planning to knock, as I always did. But something in the air felt different that morning. The kind of intuition that makes your hand hover before you act. A heaviness, a silence too still for comfort. I turned the key. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of cologne and something sweeter, perfume I didn't recognize. The blinds were half drawn, letting in slivers of light that cut across the living room floor like sharp glass. His jacket was draped over the couch. My heart thudded in the quiet. I remember thinking maybe he's just asleep. Maybe I'd surprise him and he'd smile and everything would feel normal again. But as I stepped down the hall, I heard it. The low murmur of voices, the sound of laughter that wasn't mine. Then the unmistakable rhythm of movement behind a door that had no reason to be closed. Time didn't stop. It stretched. My body moved before my mind could protest. The doors swung open with the smallest push. And there they were, Ethan, Claire, the two people I trusted most, tangled together in the sheets of the bed where I had dreamed of my future. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to the sound of my own heartbeat, heavy and uneven. Ethan turned, startled for only an instant before his face shifted, not to guilt, but to arrogance. A smirk, cruel and sharp, curling at the edge of his mouth. "What are you gonna do?" his voice sneered. "Cry." I didn't cry, not then, not ever for him. I stood there long enough to memorize the scene. The sheets. The half-empty wine bottle on the nightstand. Claire's diamond earring glinting on the pillow, a mirror of the one I had gifted her last Christmas. Everything in that room was proof of the story I had been too blind to see. And in that moment, something inside me, something soft and trusting, broke cleanly apart. I walked out without a word. The air outside felt foreign, like I was breathing in a different world. The city hummed around me, indifferent to the collapse of my life. I thought of all the things we'd built together, the engagement ring, the joint account, the lease we'd signed for the new condo that was supposed to be our forever home. I thought of the wedding invitations I had ordered the night before. They were probably still in the printer's inbox, waiting for my approval. My whole future was hanging by a thread, and all I could think was, he mocked me for caring. That was when the rage began. Not loud, not dramatic, just slow, steady, and cold. People think rage means screaming, breaking things, losing control, but real rage is quiet. It's the moment you decide you're done playing fair. It's the stillness of a storm before it strikes. That night, I went back to my apartment and sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. There were dozens of messages, Ethan's half-hearted apologies, Claire's meaningless justifications, friends asking if I was okay. I deleted them all. I didn't need words anymore. I needed a plan. By morning, the pain had hardened into purpose. If he wanted to mock me for being weak, I would show him what weakness truly looked like, when every safety net he thought he had vanished beneath him. I poured myself a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and stared at the folder that held everything: the joint investments, the condo documents, the list of vendors under my name. My hands trembled not from grief but from clarity. He had built his world on my trust, and now I would quietly take it apart. Piece by piece, contract by contract, promise by promise. He would lose everything, and I wouldn't even have to raise my voice. As the sun rose that morning, I closed my laptop and smiled for the first time in days, because love had ended, and strategy had begun. When love ends, what remains isn't emptiness, it's residue. The kind that clings to everything: your bed sheets, your passwords, your bank accounts, your name. Ethan hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had tied his life to mine in ways that gave him comfort and control. But he made one mistake: he underestimated me. He thought I'd crumble, vanish quietly, become a ghost haunting the corners of a life he'd already moved on from. He didn't realize I had built every part of our world with precision. And precision, when turned inward, can become a weapon. I spent the next few days not in tears, but in observation. I replayed every memory like footage, not for nostalgia, but for information. Every dinner conversation, every login we'd shared, every financial document he'd handed me to sign, because you read better with numbers. He had made a show of trusting me with the details he didn't care to understand. Now those details would become my blueprint. The wedding had been scheduled for 6 weeks away. The deposits had been made: venue, catering, photography, the dress. All under my name. Every receipt, every confirmation email sat neatly in folders on my laptop. He hadn't contributed a cent yet. He'd promised to wire his half once his next project bonus came in. But that money would never come. Not from him. And not to me. The first step was silence. I didn't post online, didn't answer calls, didn't tell anyone what had happened. Silence is powerful when people expect noise. It makes them nervous. It makes them wonder what you're planning. I wanted Ethan to feel that unease growing, to start guessing at what I might do, to imagine every possible version of my revenge until he couldn't tell what was real. The second step was control. Control of everything he thought we shared. I started with the condo. The mortgage wasn't in both our names yet. Only the offer letter was signed, and the bank approval was still pending. But the preliminary documents listed me as the primary applicant, with Ethan as a secondary co-signer. The loan officer, a polite man named Harris, had been dealing with me exclusively. I emailed him that morning, my message calm and professional. "I'll be handling the property paperwork alone from here. Mr. Grayson won't be part of the purchase after all." Harris replied within minutes, confirming the change and asking if there were any personal complications. I simply wrote, "He's no longer relevant to this transaction." And with that, the home Ethan had bragged about, our dream place, as he called it, became mine alone. The irony was exquisite. He cheated on me in a bedroom he didn't even own. Next came the wedding. I called each vendor, one by one, the florist, the planner, the photographer, and canceled the bookings under polite pretenses. The deposits were non-refundable, of course, but all of them had been paid through the joint account Ethan had transferred money into for wedding management. He never noticed that my name was listed first on every contract, which meant legally the refunds, if any, would return to me. By the third day, I had severed every tie except one, the engagement ring. It was a flawless solitaire diamond, set in platinum, worth nearly $25,000. He had made a show of buying it in front of friends, pretending it was a romantic surprise. What he hadn't realized was that the store receipt, the proof of purchase, had been emailed to my account when he used the joint card to pay for it. That single oversight meant the ring was legally mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. The symbol of his promise will become the tool of his undoing. I placed it in its velvet box and locked it in my desk drawer, not out of sentiment, but strategy. I wasn't finished with it yet. While Ethan was likely parading his new truth with Claire, I began preparing mine, not in public, but in paperwork. Emails, contracts, text backups, call logs. I wasn't gathering revenge and emotion. I was gathering evidence in silence. In relationships built on lies, documentation is power. By the 5th day, the silence started working. Ethan called 12 times, then 6 more, then stopped altogether. His arrogance was predictable. He thought I was sulking, waiting for him to come back, to offer some half-hearted apology. He didn't know I was dismantling his safety net one line item at a time. And when silence didn't get a reaction, he started to panic. The first sign came from mutual friends. They messaged me cautiously, saying Ethan had been worried, that he thought I was taking things too far. Too far? He had destroyed my faith, my plans, my home, and still thought the limits were his to define. That was the moment I knew he hadn't learned anything yet. He still thought he held power. And that made my next step simple. I logged into our shared email account, the one we use for coordinating wedding vendors. I opened the folder marked investments. Inside were his real estate plans, the early drafts of a partnership he'd been forming with his father's construction firm. He had used my name as a guarantor for some of the deals to make his proposal appear more stable. The arrogance of it was stunning, using me as proof of credibility while he betrayed me behind closed doors. I printed everything: contracts, emails, attachments, each one a piece of evidence waiting to become leverage. When people betray you, they don't just leave emotional damage, they leave paper trails. And those trails are often the path to their downfall. A week after the discovery, I walked through the condo site for what should have been our new home. The walls were half built, the floor still raw concrete, the smell of new plaster sharp in the air. I ran my hand along the unfinished doorway and imagined what might have been, the life that could have existed if love had been real. But sentimentality is a weakness I no longer allowed myself. That house wasn't a monument to loss, it was a chessboard. And every move from here on out would be deliberate. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and began writing the first draft of my plan, not a revenge fantasy, but a financial strategy. I wasn't going to destroy Ethan through drama or exposure. I was going to dismantle him through precision, using the systems he thought protected him. Because the truth was, I didn't want him to suffer publicly. I wanted him to live with what he'd done, quietly, privately, completely stripped of comfort. And when the time came, I would make sure the final blow came from the one thing he valued most, money. As midnight bled into morning, I closed my notebook and looked around my small apartment. The world felt quieter now. Not peaceful, but poised. I had been the fool once. Now I would become the lesson. Revenge rarely begins with fire. It begins with arithmetic, numbers, signatures, and quiet precision. The most devastating betrayals are undone not by fury, but by paperwork. Ethan had taken my trust and converted it into leverage. I would take his arrogance and convert it into loss. The engagement ring was my entry point. It sat in a black velvet box on my desk, a small glittering monument to hypocrisy. To anyone else, it was a promise. To me, it was evidence, the last physical remnant of a lie. The moment I opened the box again, it didn't sparkle. It smirked. He had bought it on our shared card, linked to an account I managed. I had paid that card as balance every month, a detail he hadn't noticed because I was the one who handled the bills. The purchase record clearly showed my payments clearing the debt. In legal terms, that meant the ring wasn't a gift from him. It was a purchase made with joint funds, cleared with my income. It wasn't a symbol of commitment anymore. It was a claimable asset. That was my first step, establishing ownership. I gathered the receipts, payment logs, and credit statements. Every piece of proof went into a neatly labeled folder titled Return on Investment. A fitting name, I thought. The ring had started as a symbol of deception. It would end as my starting capital for his undoing. The next move was the bank. Ethan had always mocked me for my obsession with detail, the way I double-checked everything, from invoices to mortgage quotes. He said it made me neurotic. I called it foresight. That foresight meant I had memorized every login, every transaction, every financial habit he had. I knew where his money came from, how he spent it, and most importantly where he was vulnerable. Our shared savings account, the one meant for the wedding, was my first point of interest. Ethan had contributed sporadically, usually after bragging about new deals or bonuses. But most of the balance had come from me, months of saving, planning, budgeting. He assumed I would never touch it without his approval. He forgot whose name appeared first on the account. That morning, I visited the bank in person. I dressed in a tailored suit, calm and composed, the image of professionalism. Rage never wins against systems, but composure always does. The clerk recognized me from our previous visits. Joint account adjustments? She asked kindly. I smiled. Just a reclassification. The process was tedious but straightforward. Because I had initiated the account, I could request temporary restriction of the secondary holder's access pending personal review. The phrase sounded harmless, bureaucratic, the kind that bankers process without question. Within an hour, Ethan's card was flagged for verification. He wouldn't notice until he tried to withdraw money later that day. I walked out of the bank with a printed confirmation in hand. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was movement. The same afternoon, I took the engagement ring to an appraiser downtown. The woman behind the counter examined it carefully, nodding with quiet admiration. Perfect clarity, she said, jotting notes. Retail value, around $25,000, but resell? 15 to 18, depending on urgency. Urgency was precisely what I had. I didn't need its worth. I needed its transformation. I didn't sell it immediately. Instead, I placed it in a safety deposit box, along with a small envelope containing the documents I'd been gathering. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. His promises locked away, stripped of their sparkle, waiting to become the foundation of something practical. That night, I sat at my desk, the city humming outside my window, and opened my notebook again. I wasn't planning a spectacle. I wasn't going to slash tires or post scandalous photos or call his family in rage. No, I would do something far more permanent. I would make his financial stability unravel slowly, methodically, until the man who mocked me for weakness would beg for the stability I once provided him. The plan needed precision. I started by mapping his assets, investment accounts, 3, under his name, linked to his firm's bonuses. Pending condo deal, removed from his name as of last week. Savings account, now restricted. Business partnership proposal, dependent on my signature as guarantor. Personal debt, 3 credit cards, 1 shared. He had built a life that looked rich on the outside, but was leveraged on borrowed reputation, much of it propped up by my cooperation. Remove that foundation and his empire would collapse in silence. The key was timing. If I struck too fast, he'd notice and fight back. If I moved too slow, he'd adapt. The sweet spot was confusion, the kind that erodes confidence before the truth becomes visible. The first domino fell 2 days later. Ethan's card declined at a restaurant. His text came that evening, a cold, performative message pretending to be concerned. Hey, did something happen with the bank? My account's frozen. You might have made a mistake. I didn't reply. The second domino came 3 days later when his business partner, his father's associate, a man named Collins, called to confirm my status as guarantor. I told him, politely, that my name was no longer associated with Ethan's finances. The line went silent for a moment. Collins thanked me, his tone suddenly colder. The call lasted 40 seconds. The consequences of it would last months. By the end of the week, Ethan had lost access to liquidity, credibility, and composure. He sent emails, panicked, then angry, then pleading. He alternated between self-pity and entitlement, telling me I was acting insane, that I was hurting us both. But there was no us left to hurt. There was only him, and the echo of his arrogance catching up to him. The best part? Every move I made was legal. Every signature was mine to revoke. Every asset I reclaimed was rightfully earned. Couldn't he accuse me of sabotage without confessing how dependent he had been on me to begin with? While he scrambled to rebuild, I moved quietly forward. I listed the wedding inventory, the dress, the decor, the unused invitations on resale platforms. Each item sold quickly, each transaction feeding a separate account in my name. I called it the reclamation fund. It wasn't about the money. It was about symbolism. Every dollar was proof that I could turn his betrayal into independence. By the end of the month, Ethan had stopped calling. By the end of the next, I knew he was drowning. Word spread quickly in his circle, whispers of financial issues, delayed projects, investor pullouts. Claire, once proudly attached to his side, began fading from social media. Their curated perfection crumbled, pixel by pixel. I didn't need to interfere. The world does most of the work for you when it smells weakness. But I wasn't finished. I hadn't yet pulled the final thread, the one that would make him understand just how completely he'd lost control. The ring was still waiting, locked in that deposit box. Not as jewelry, but as collateral, a tool for something far larger than revenge. Because I had discovered something new in the process. Ethan had a habit of playing with investors' money through private accounts registered to my name for tax convenience. He had used my clean record to build his credibility. And now, I could make that same credibility disappear, taking his reputation with it. All it would take was one letter. One carefully worded notice to his company's auditors, attaching the right documents, sent from the right address. And when that letter reached his boardroom, Ethan wouldn't just lose money. He'd lose trust. In the world he lived in, that was worse than losing love. I closed the notebook that night and looked at the city lights flickering through my window. The reflection of the engagement ring danced faintly on the glass. It looked smaller now, just a stone, nothing more. But what it represented was enormous, the beginning of my freedom. And the end of his illusion. There is a kind of silence that exists right before a man's world collapses, a quiet hum in the background of his confidence. I had learned to hear it. Ethan's voice, once so certain, was beginning to waver in the few messages he still sent. He didn't know what was happening yet, only that things were slipping, contracts delayed, investors avoiding his calls, numbers no longer adding up. He thought it was bad luck. He didn't know it was me. Every revenge needs a single defining moment. A point of no return. For me, it was the letter, not a rant. Not a confession. Just a simple clinical packet of truth. The packet was thin, 3 printed pages and 2 attached documents. The first page was a formal notification addressed to the Compliance and Audit Division of Greyline Development Group, his father's firm. It stated in clear and professional terms that certain financial guarantees and account authorizations listed under my name were used without my explicit written consent. The language was precise, factual, unemotional. The kind of tone that people in suits take very seriously. I included the proof, the joint account statements, the investment proposals, and the small but crucial email from Ethan's company domain asking me to just sign this one and I'll handle the details later. That email, which I had saved months before, was my detonator. I had signed that document back when I believed love meant trust. Now, it was the receipt for his downfall. I printed it on heavy cream-colored paper, the kind used for official correspondence, and sealed it in a plain envelope. No threats, no accusations, just evidence. Then I mailed it certified, tracked, and signed for delivery. When the post office clerk stamped the parcel, I felt something lift inside me, not joy, not excitement, just weightlessness. I didn't need to watch it explode. I only needed to know it was already in motion. Ethan's firm prided itself on clean records. His father had built it over 30 years, brick by brick, on reputation alone. A single suggestion of impropriety was enough to cause ripples. My letter wasn't an accusation, it was an inquiry. And inquiries, when they reach corporate auditors, never stay quiet for long. The next 48 hours passed like still water, no word. No confirmation. Just waiting. But silence doesn't mean inactivity, it means preparation. I imagined boardrooms filling with tense conversations, whispered questions, papers spread across tables. I imagined Ethan being called in unexpectedly, his confidence masking confusion. I imagined the look on his face when he realized that the walls he had leaned on were built with my name carved into the foundation. On the third morning, I got confirmation. A delivery receipt with his company's signature. The letter had been received. That evening, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. Then another, and another, then a message. You've gone too far, no name, no need for one. It was Ethan. He had finally understood. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The kind of breath that comes not from relief, but from control. The story had inverted. The man who once mocked me for caring was now unraveling in the same quiet way he had dismantled my trust. Except my method left no evidence of malice. Every move I made was clean, legal, and verifiable. He couldn't accuse me of sabotage without proving his own deceit. I didn't reply to his message. There was nothing left to say. I just turned off my phone, poured a glass of wine, and watched the rain streak the window like ink bleeding across a page. By the end of the week, the industry began to buzz. Construction deals paused for review. A few of Ethan's social media accounts went private. Mutual acquaintances sent me vague messages like, "Is everything okay between you two?" I said nothing. In their silence, gossip would ferment faster than any lie I could tell. The most satisfying revenge isn't public humiliation, it's private collapse. The kind where a man wakes up every morning wondering when the next blow will come. I heard from a friend at his firm that an internal audit had begun. Not an accusation yet, but an examination of documentation irregularities. Words like that are the death sentence of corporate men. They hang heavy in emails and echo in conference rooms. The same week, Ethan's father quietly withdrew his signature from the real estate partnership Ethan had been boasting about for months. Without that endorsement, Ethan's career wasn't merely damaged, it was amputated. And through it all, I stayed invisible. I kept my routines simple: work, gym, home. I didn't post on social media, didn't gossip, didn't explain. The power of silence grew with every day I refused to participate in his panic. When people can't predict your next move, they invent worse ones for you. That uncertainty became my ally. 3 weeks after the letter, I received an email from a law office, a polite, formal notice confirming that my claims had been reviewed and that I bore no liability for the financial authorizations under question. There it was, my final insulation. The company has severed me completely from his misconduct. The same evidence that protected me would condemn him. I read the letter twice, printed it once, and placed it in my safe beside the engagement ring box. 2 symbols of closure, one glittering, one stamped with corporate ink. Meanwhile, Ethan's downfall gathered speed. He had always prided himself on control, on knowing the right people. But reputation collapses faster than wealth. Investors pulled out of his smaller projects. His bank requested revised statements. Even his father, the man who had once praised him as his successor, started introducing someone else at industry events. By the time his career's edges had fully frayed, Claire was gone. She disappeared from every trace of his life, no photos, no tags, no mention. The woman who had once shared his arrogance had moved on, leaving him alone in the wreckage he'd created. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Revenge isn't a party. It's an exhale. The satisfaction wasn't in watching him fall, it was in knowing I didn't have to lift a hand anymore. I had turned the system he once used to belittle me into the tool that dismantled him. One night, weeks later, I walked past a high-rise downtown, one of Ethan's failed development sites. The windows were dark, the signboard stripped. Rain pooled on the pavement, reflecting the emptiness of an unfinished dream. I stood there for a moment, staring at the shell of what could have been our life. I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance. The world has a strange way of balancing itself when you stop trying to control it. Ethan has spent years manipulating others to maintain his image. I had spent months learning to disappear from his. The difference was that he built his power on illusions, and I built mine on evidence. By the time the company officially terminated his position, the story had become public enough to sting. His name appeared in a small headline buried in a financial column. Internal audit leads to leadership change. No mention of scandal, no mention of me, just implication. But implication is enough. In his world, reputation is currency. And his was now worthless. I kept the newspaper clipping in a drawer, folded neatly beside the engagement ring appraisal receipt. Together, they told a story, the rise of arrogance and the quiet art of its undoing. I didn't send him the clipping. I didn't need to. He would see it. Everyone would. And when he did, I wanted him to remember the last words he said to me that morning in his apartment. "What are you gonna do? Cry?" "No, Ethan, I didn't cry." I calculated. When revenge ends, survival begins. It's not as thrilling as people imagine. It's quiet, deliberate, and full of small, heavy choices. The storm had passed, and all that remained was stillness. Ethan's empire had crumbled, slowly, silently, and I had stood in the eye of the destruction, untouched. But survival without purpose is just existence, and I was done existing in someone else's shadow. For the first time in years, my life belonged entirely to me. The morning after I read the article about his leadership change, I woke before dawn. The city outside was wrapped in fog, and the light that bled through the curtains was pale and cold. I made coffee and sat by the window, staring at the skyline that once symbolized everything I thought success meant. Those tall glass towers, the ones Ethan worshipped, suddenly looked hollow. Beautiful cages for people who thought wealth was safety. I had spent years helping him build his career, his dreams, his future. I had written his proposals, corrected his mistakes, balanced his budgets. He had stolen my effort and turned it into ego. Now, I decided I would build something of my own, not to compete with him, but to erase the last trace of dependence from my life. I started with the ring. It was still in that safety deposit box, sealed in velvet, waiting patiently like a relic of my naivety. One last asset, one last tether. I sold it on a Monday. The jeweler handed me a certified check for $18,600, less than it was worth, but more than enough to begin again. As I walked out of the store, I felt lighter. The weight that had sat on my finger for months was finally gone. That money became my seed, not for luxury, not for indulgence, for independence. I opened a new account in my name, separate from every trace of the past, no shared access, no linked credit. I called it the Rebirth Fund. It wasn't much, but it was clean. Untouched by betrayal. The first investment I made wasn't financial, it was knowledge. I enrolled in a short business certification course downtown. Ironically, it was held in the same district where Ethan used to work. Every morning, I'd walk past the building where his name had once been printed on the lobby directory, and every morning, I'd feel a sharp reminder of how far I'd come, not backward, but beyond. Learning again was liberating. Numbers, contracts, negotiations, all the skills I had once used for someone else as success now became the tools for my own. I studied the markets he had exploited, understood the risks he had ignored, and learned to recognize patterns of greed disguised as ambition. Each page, each lecture, rewired me. But rebuilding isn't just about learning, it's about unlearning. Unlearning the instinct to please. Unlearning the reflex to apologize. unlearning the belief that love means sacrifice. By winter, I had developed a plan. A small real estate consultancy, modest, ethical, precise. I didn't want to build skyscrapers. I wanted to help people like me, women who'd lost homes, security, or self-worth to people who took advantage of their trust. I wanted to turn my story into a blueprint for others' freedom. I used what I had, my savings, the ring money, and the quiet determination that comes only from surviving humiliation. I rented a small office, barely 3 rooms and a window view of a cracked parking lot, and filled it with second-hand furniture. I named the company Greyline Advisory. A quiet, deliberate twist on Ethan's last name, Grayson. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. The first client came by accident. A divorced woman trying to sell her late husband's property but afraid of being cheated. She had heard from someone that I knew how to handle men who underestimated women. That was the moment I realized what my real business was. Not real estate. Empowerment through control. In the months that followed, my small consultancy began to grow. Word spread quietly, organically, woman to woman, like a shared secret. I never advertised. I never chased clients. They found me, those who needed help reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. Each file that crossed my desk was a story of deceit, of survival, of rebirth. And with every story I helped resolve, I felt another layer of myself heal. I wasn't just rebuilding a business. I was rebuilding belief. Meanwhile, Ethan's name occasionally surfaced in whispers, in articles, in the background noise of the same world he once ruled. He had taken a minor job under a new company, one that didn't carry his father's prestige. His arrogance had faded, replaced by the hollow politeness of a man surviving on reputation's leftovers. Claire, last I heard, had left the city entirely. Her name disappeared from the circles she once tried to impress. The empire of betrayal had collapsed into dust. But I didn't check on him. I didn't need to. The absence of curiosity was the truest form of closure. What I didn't expect was how success would feel different this time. It wasn't intoxicating. It was grounding. I no longer wanted applause or validation. I wanted stability, quiet mornings, honest work, a life that didn't depend on anyone's permission. By the end of the year, Greyline had expanded into 3 cities. I hired 2 assistants, both women rebuilding their own lives from failure. The office became more than a workspace. It was a haven, a place where every document signed, every deal closed, symbolized reclamation. And then, one afternoon, as sunlight spilled across my desk, I received an envelope addressed in handwriting I recognized instantly. Sharp, masculine, controlled. Ethan. Inside was a single-page letter. No apologies. No anger. Just a hollow attempt at redemption. He said he was doing better, that he had learned his lessons, that he hoped time had brought me peace. He ended with a line that almost made me laugh. You were always smarter than me. I just didn't see it until it was too late. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the same drawer where I had once kept the engagement ring. It belonged there, as a relic, not a wound. I didn't reply, because there was nothing left to say. The next morning I arrived at my office early. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the glass buildings gold. I watched the city wake cars starting, vendors shouting, people hurrying toward futures they believed in. For the first time, I wasn't running toward or away from anything. I was exactly where I wanted to be. I turned on the lights, poured myself coffee, and looked at the nameplate on my desk. Ava Grey, founder, Greyline Advisory. The same woman who had once been mocked with the words, "What are you gonna do? Cry?" had turned that insult into a foundation. She hadn't cried. She had calculated, dismantled, rebuilt. And as the office filled with light, I realized the truest revenge was never in destruction. It was in creation. He had left me broken. I had turned that break into architecture. A structure of my own making. Unshakable, unforgivable, unapologetically mine. Success, when it finally arrives, doesn't come with music. It comes quietly, like morning light creeping into a room you forgot you left open. For months my days were steady, peaceful, and purposeful. Greyline Advisory had grown from a single desk into a company with a reputation built on integrity. Clients came not because of advertisements but because of whispers, women recommending me to other women, stories traveling through networks that thrived on trust. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving someone else's decisions, I was creating my own future. But the past has a strange way of circling back, not as a ghost, but as a test. It waits until you've rebuilt your world, until your confidence feels stable, and then it knocks. Softly, politely, like a reminder. Mine came on a Tuesday. It began with an email. The subject line was ordinary. Consultation request, Urban Crest Holdings. The name struck me faintly. Familiar, though I couldn't place it. I almost ignored it until I opened the message and saw the attached document. Urban Crest Holdings. A real estate investment firm seeking consultation on a large redevelopment project downtown, near the district where Ethan's old company once stood. The proposal was detailed, professional, and urgent. It ended with a signature I hadn't seen in over a year. Ethan Grayson, Vice President, Development. I stared at the screen for a long time, expressionless. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. He was back, not in my personal life, but standing across the table from me in the one arena where I now held all the power. The email was polite, detached, almost painfully formal. It wasn't a trap, I knew. He needed my expertise. Greyline had become known for its efficiency in navigating stalled projects, exactly the kind of crisis his company, newly rebuilt, was facing. I didn't reply immediately. I sat there, fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside. Part of me wanted to delete it and move on. Another part, the calm, calculating part that had learned to use emotion as data, saw an opportunity, not for revenge, for completion. That night, I reviewed the attached proposal in detail. His company's numbers were clean on paper, but I could see the cracks instantly. Misallocated budgets, unrealistic profit margins, a funding structure held together by optimism rather than planning. The kind of overreach that had destroyed him once before, only this time he was asking me to fix it. I sent a short reply the next morning. Mr. Grayson, Greyline Advisory is available for consultation. I'll review the case personally. Let's schedule a meeting next week. No emotion, no history, just business. The meeting took place in a glass-walled conference room downtown, neutral ground. I arrived 10 minutes early, composed, dressed in the confidence of someone who had built her success from ashes. When he walked in for a brief moment, I saw the man I had once loved, familiar eyes, the same deliberate stride. But the arrogance was gone. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but spiritually, a man who had learned what losing truly meant. He extended a hand. I shook it, professional, cold. He spoke first, polite, distant, performing the role of an executive trying to pretend the past had never happened. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He knew the balance of power had shifted. As he explained the project, I listened, not to his words, but to what they revealed. He was trying to rebuild his reputation, to convince investors that he could be trusted again. And for that, he needed my endorsement. My company's name, clean and respected, was the key to his redemption. He didn't realize that, in asking for my help, he was handing me the final proof of my victory. I took notes. I asked sharp questions. I challenged assumptions. Every time I spoke, he flinched slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. I was no longer the woman who once made coffee while he read contracts I had written. I was the one who could now decide whether his new empire stood or fell. When the meeting ended, he thanked me, his tone sincere but careful. I could feel the tension between us, a fragile line of shared history stretched thin by professionalism. As he turned to leave, I said, I'll review the documentation and let you know if Greyline can commit. He nodded. Of course, and left. The silence he left behind was strange, not painful, not satisfying, just still. I realized, sitting there, that I no longer hated him. Hatred requires energy. He no longer deserved that. Over the next week, I analyzed his company's finances thoroughly. It was a decent project but dangerously unstable. His investors were aggressive, and his team lacked oversight. If I signed on, Greyline could stabilize it, but it would mean saving him again. The irony wasn't lost on me. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who believed saving him meant loving him. That woman had been destroyed by his betrayal. The one sitting here now didn't need to destroy him again. She only needed to decide if helping him served her. When my report was ready, I sent it directly to his inbox. No emotion, no hidden message, just truth. Your projected returns are unsustainable. Your financing model relies on unsecured capital and inflated valuations. Proceeding under current terms would be irresponsible. Greyline declines participation. Then, after a pause, I added one last line. I wish you better judgment this time. And with that, I pressed send. 2 days later, I received his reply, brief, composed, and honest. Thank you for your honesty. I understand. Take care, Ava. That was it. No plea, no defense. Just acknowledgement. The final thread between us severed cleanly. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of years dissolving like fog under sunlight. The circle had closed. I had seen him at his highest, at his cruelest, at his lowest, and now finally at his most human. And in that moment, I understood that forgiveness isn't about letting someone back in. It's about no longer needing to close the door. That evening, I walked home through the city streets. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with orange and violet. I passed the old district where we had once looked at wedding venues, the place where everything had begun to unravel. The building was gone now, replaced by a new development, brighter, stronger, standing on better foundations. I stopped for a moment and smiled, because that was me now. Not rebuilt, reborn. Everything he broke, I had rebuilt stronger. Everything he mocked, I had mastered. And everything he took, I had learned to live without. As night fell and city lights flickered on, I realized something profound. Revenge had ended long ago. This was redemption. And it was mine, in full irrevocable ownership. Success has a sound. It's not applause or praise, it's quieter than that. It's the hum of your name being spoken in rooms you've never entered, the weight of your work moving through networks that once ignored you. I didn't realize how far Greyline had come until the day a journalist called asking for an interview. Her name was Lydia Monroe, a senior features writer from the Capital Ledger, a business magazine known for profiling rising leaders and self-made entrepreneurs. She said she'd been following my company's work, particularly how Greyline had gained a reputation for helping women navigate property law, inheritance disputes, and post-divorce financial recovery. At first, I hesitated. I'd built Greyline quietly, avoiding spotlights and attention. My clients valued privacy, and so did I, but Lydia's tone wasn't intrusive. It was curious. She said she wanted to tell a story not about business, but about resilience. The word lingered with me, resilience. It felt truer than success. We scheduled the interview for the following week at my office. The morning I woke early, the city still dark outside my window. I stood before the mirror, smoothing the sleeves of my charcoal blazer. There were no traces of the woman I used to be, the one who measured her worth by someone else's love. The reflection staring back at me now belonged to someone steady, someone rebuilt. When Lydia arrived, she brought a sense of calm professionalism that immediately put me at ease. Her questions began simple, about my company, my clients, my principles. But as the conversation deepened, she leaned forward slightly, pen hovering over her notebook. "What made you start Greyline?" she asked. It was an innocent question, but I felt the air shift. I could have answered with numbers, strategy, or ambition. But instead, I told the truth, the sanitized version, the one that carried emotion but no names. I started it, I said slowly, because I lost everything I thought made me valuable. My relationship, my stability, my home. I had to learn the hard way that control is the only form of security that lasts. Greyline isn't just a business, it's a promise. No one should have to start over from nothing without understanding how much power they actually have. Lydia's pen stopped moving. She met my eyes. So this company is personal, I nodded. Every contract we draft, every negotiation we handle, every property we recover, is not just paperwork. It's someone reclaiming their voice, their dignity, their future. There was a long pause. Then Lydia smiled, not the polite kind journalists use, but the genuine kind of someone who recognizes truth when she hears it. The interview lasted 2 hours. We spoke about resilience, rebuilding, and the quiet strength that comes from being underestimated. She asked if I believed in forgiveness. I told her forgiveness wasn't a duty. It was a luxury you earn once you no longer need it. When she left, I didn't think much of it. It felt like another conversation, meaningful but private. I didn't realize that her article would reach farther than any marketing campaign could. 2 weeks later, the Capital Ledger released the piece under the headline, "The Woman Who Rebuilt Herself and an Industry." The story went viral. Not because it was sensational, but because it was real. Lydia had written it with care, weaving my words into a narrative that resonated with people far beyond the world of business. Women and men reached out from across the country. Messages poured into my inbox from strangers sharing their stories: betrayal, loss, financial manipulation, divorce. Some wrote just to say thank you. Others asked for help. Greyline's phone lines flooded with inquiries. Within a month, I was hiring new advisors, expanding our services, creating mentorship programs for women entering real estate law. What had started as my private redemption had become a movement. And yet, with all the attention came something unexpected: exposure. People from my past began recognizing the details in the article, the timeline, the tone. The description of a fiancé who mocked her pain. They whispered names, connected dots, speculated. And eventually it reached Ethan. I didn't hear from him directly. But one morning, I received a short, unsigned letter in the mail. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, his. "You told the story well. You left out the names, but I recognized the truth. I'm glad you found peace. I hope you know I finally learned what you were trying to teach me." No apology, no self-pity, just acknowledgement. A line drawn in ink between past and present. I folded the letter, placed it in the same folder as the old ones, the ones that told the story of how this all began. The folder that had once been evidence of betrayal was now a chronicle of evolution. I didn't feel anger, only finality. The attention from the article opened doors I never expected. Invitations came from universities, business panels, conferences. They wanted me to speak, not as a victim, but as a strategist. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who once sat in silence while her fiancé mocked her now stood behind microphones, teaching others how to rebuild from ruin. At my first speaking event, the auditorium was full, hundreds of faces looking up, waiting to hear something worth carrying home. I began the way Lydia had once prompted me to. "I built a company out of the ashes of my engagement," I said, "but the company wasn't the point. The point was proving to myself that destruction can be a blueprint if you learn how to read it." The room fell silent. I continued. "We live in a world that teaches women to measure love by how much they're willing to lose. I learned that the only love worth keeping is the kind that doesn't require you to abandon yourself." When I finished, there was a long, heavy quiet, and then applause. The kind that doesn't explode, but builds, wave after wave, from genuine understanding. As I stood there, beneath the stage lights, I realized the truth about my story. It had never been about Ethan, or betrayal, or revenge. It was about reclamation. About turning pain into property, emotional, financial, and spiritual. After the event, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she'd found her fiancé cheating 2 weeks earlier. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. I smiled softly. "Start by not crying," I said. "Start by calculating." Her expression shifted, confusion at first, then realization. She nodded. Walking out of the auditorium that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace unburdened by strategy. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was leading. And yet, deep inside, a quiet thought lingered, a question I had never truly faced. Who would I become when I no longer needed the past to define me? The answer I knew was waiting in whatever came next. Growth brings temptation. When your name begins to echo in the halls of power, people start knocking, not to congratulate you, but to claim a piece of what you've built. I'd seen it before. With Ethan, with his father's firm, with every company that grew too fast. The higher you climb, the more quietly greed waits in the shadows. By the spring following the article's release, Greyline Advisory had become more than a firm. It was a movement. We were handling high-profile clients, winning cases that made headlines, and setting precedents for women reclaiming financial autonomy. Every success brought new offers, investors, partnerships, expansion deals. I had turned down most of them, preferring control over scale. But then came the Meridian Group. They were one of the most powerful real estate investment corporations in the country, international, influential, and relentless. They didn't send an email or a polite introduction. They sent a courier. A man in a suit, carrying a sealed folder embossed with their gold insignia. Inside was an offer that glittered like temptation itself. Global expansion. Full funding. Equity partnership. Greyline would go international under my leadership, offices in London, Dubai, and New York within 2 years. It was everything I had dreamed of, and everything I had sworn to be cautious about. At first glance, the deal seemed flawless. They offered freedom, autonomy, and resources beyond anything I'd ever had access to. But hidden between the polished clauses and flattering projections was a single name that froze my blood: Urban Crest Holdings. Ethan's company. Buried in the fine print, I found the connection. Meridian was acquiring Urban Crest as part of a merger. Ethan's division would become part of the same umbrella corporation that now wanted to absorb my company. In other words, signing this deal would mean working under the same parent entity as the man who once destroyed me. It was almost poetic, the universe offering me everything, but at a price only I would recognize. That night, I sat in my office long after everyone had gone home. The city shimmered outside, a map of lights and reflections. The offer letter sat open on my desk, the pages glowing under the lamp. I could feel the pull of ambition, the voice that whispered, "You've earned this." But beneath it was another voice, quieter but sharper. At what cost? I thought of what Greyline stood for. We weren't just another consulting firm. We were a sanctuary for people rebuilding from exploitation. Our entire identity was built on independence, on teaching others not to sell their freedom for stability. How could I accept an offer that contradicted everything I had built? But turning it down meant walking away from scale, influence, and power, the kind that could change lives globally. It meant choosing principle over opportunity. And principle doesn't always pay the bills. The following week, I agreed to meet Meridian's executives. The meeting was held in their downtown headquarters, a towering glass monument to ambition. The boardroom was wide, cold, and sterile, overlooking the city like a god watching from above. The lead negotiator, a man named Victor Halle, spoke with the polished ease of someone used to getting yeses. He praised Greyline's ethics, our impact, our unique feminine approach to finance. I smiled politely at that phrase, already cataloging it as a red flag. Then he said it. "Of course, with the merger, Urban Crest Holdings will be one of your sister divisions. But don't worry, their team has been restructured completely. The old leadership is out. He said it casually, as if it were an irrelevant detail. I looked him in the eye. Out? He nodded. Yes, their former vice president resigned last quarter. I believe his name was... He checked his notes. Grayson. Ethan Grayson. There it was, the ghost of a name that had once defined my life, now reduced to a line in someone's binder. I said nothing, just nodded. The information landed differently than I expected, not with anger, not with nostalgia, but with finality. His story had ended, mine was still being written. Victor continued his pitch, detailing numbers, percentages, timelines. I listened carefully, asked questions, and took notes. The offer was powerful, too powerful. They would own 40% of Greyline, with promises of independence in spirit. But I had learned what independence in spirit really meant. It was the language of control disguised as freedom. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my balcony, the city humming below, and thought about the paradox of success. I had fought so hard to reclaim control, only to be tempted now to surrender it for expansion. The irony was almost cruel. But the truth was clear. If I said yes, I'd become what I once destroyed, a name on someone else's letterhead. A brand owned by a system that had once buried me. So, I made a decision. The next morning I called Victor. My voice was calm, professional, and absolute. Greyline will remain independent, I said. We appreciate the offer, but we've already survived without help. He sounded surprised. Are you sure? I'm sure, I said. We're not here to join empires. We're here to build them for people who've been denied one. There was silence on the other end. Then a clipped, polite farewell. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace, not triumph, just quiet certainty. Within weeks, the business magazines ran stories about Meridian's acquisitions. Their empire grew larger, but colder. Greyline's decision to decline the merger became a footnote, the independent firm that said no. What they didn't know was that the decision has saved not just my company but my integrity. That summer, I moved Greyline into a new headquarters, not downtown among the glass towers, but in an old renovated building by the river. Exposed brick, open windows, sunlight spilling onto wooden desks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The first morning in the new office, I gathered my team and said, "We're not going to be the biggest firm. We're going to be the firm that outlasts them." They smiled. They understood. That evening, as I locked up and walked outside, I caught my reflection in the glass door. Older, steadier, stronger. The woman staring back didn't look like someone who had survived heartbreak. She looked like someone who had mastered herself. Behind me, the river glimmered in the fading light. It reminded me of how everything flows, loss, love, power, peace, always moving, always reshaping. And I realized that what I had built was more than a business. It was a declaration that no betrayal, no empire, no name, not even his, could ever own me again. Legacies aren't born from power, they're born from purpose. For years, I thought my legacy would be revenge, a monument to my endurance, proof that I had survived what should have broken me. But revenge burns out. Purpose endures. And I was beginning to see that Greyline, the company I had built from the ruins of humiliation, had grown into something far larger than me. It started quietly with one client, then another and another. Women from all walks of life came to our office carrying stories that mirrored pieces of my own. Some had been abandoned, others cheated, others silenced by systems that favored those with louder voices or deeper pockets. They came frightened, uncertain, exhausted, and they left stronger. I used to think my strength came from what I'd done to Ethan, the calculated dismantling of his empire, the control I seized back from him piece by piece. But true strength, I was learning, came from what I could give others. By the time autumn arrived, Greyline had become more than a consultancy. It was a network, a sisterhood of reclamation. Our new riverfront headquarters buzzed with energy. Former clients became advisors. Advisors became mentors. And slowly a culture emerged, one built on clarity, not chaos. We hosted workshops titled Reclaiming What's Yours. We launched legal aid programs for women without resources. We even started a fund that provided small loans to those starting over after financial betrayal. Every time I saw one of them sign her first contract, buy her first property, or open her own business, I felt the same quiet pride I'd once imagined I'd feel walking down an aisle, except this time I wasn't walking toward someone else. I was walking toward the life I had built for myself, one success story at a time. But with success came a new kind of attention. One morning, I received a call from a local university. They wanted to name me as a guest lecturer for their new Ethics in Real Estate program. At first, I laughed softly. The irony was almost poetic. The woman whose engagement had collapsed in scandal was now being asked to teach ethics. But the dean's voice was sincere. "Your story isn't about scandal," he said. "It's about integrity. About knowing when to walk away and when to build again." I accepted. Standing at that lectern months later, facing a room full of young professionals, men and women who would soon enter the same cutthroat industry that had once consumed me, I told them the truth. I told them that success wasn't about winning. It was about knowing what you're willing to lose and what you'll never trade again. I told them that ethics don't protect you from betrayal, but they protect you from becoming what betrayed you. When I finished, the students didn't just applaud, they stood. The sound wasn't loud, but it was heavy with meaning. I had spent so many years chasing validation from one man. Now, I had earned respect from hundreds who didn't even know my past, only the lessons I'd drawn from it. That night, I sat alone in my office after everyone had gone home. The city outside glowed against the dark river. My desk was cluttered with papers, proposals, and photographs, reminders of everything Greyline had become. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one who had opened a bedroom door and found her entire world ending in a single moment. I wished I could tell her that it wasn't the end, that it was the beginning she didn't know she needed. Then, as if the universe wanted to close the loop one final time, I received a message that took me by surprise. It came from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "You've built something extraordinary. I'm glad I knew you before you became who you were meant to be." There was no name. But I didn't need one. It wasn't an intrusion, it was acknowledgement. The past at last had learned its place. It could watch, but never interfere again. I smiled, deleted the message, and leaned back in my chair. The sound of the river filled the silence. Outside, the city lights reflected across the water, small, trembling, but constant. And for the first time in my life, I understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't about the buildings we owned or the names printed on our business cards. It wasn't about revenge, wealth, or even redemption. Legacy was the quiet ripple your strength leaves behind, the lives that change because you refuse to break. That ripple was spreading now, through every client, every employee, every woman who'd ever walked through my doors. It carried my story forward, not as tragedy, but as blueprint. The irony was perfect. Ethan had once asked me, "What are you gonna do?" Cry. I hadn't cried, I'd calculated. And then I'd built something that would outlive both of us. When I left the office that night, I locked the door and looked out at the river one last time. The air was cool, the moon reflected in the dark water like a coin waiting to be claimed. My life no longer needed a story of betrayal. It was now a story of legacy, one I had never planned, but one I had earned completely. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. Years pass, and what once felt unbearable becomes simply a story, one you can revisit without flinching. That's what the past had become for me. Not an open wound, not even a scar that ached when the weather changed, but a faint echo that no longer needed to be answered. It had been 7 years since that morning, the day I opened a door, and watched my world collapse in silence. I no longer marked the anniversary, it had lost meaning. The pain had served its purpose, and then it left, as all temporary things must. What remained was what I had built after it, the life that grew from the ashes. Greyline Advisory was now a name spoken with respect in cities I had never even visited. Our programs had expanded into multiple countries, not through greed or ambition, but through genuine need. We were helping people rebuild, not just their finances, but their belief in fairness, in control, in themselves. The office by the river still stood, though we long outgrown it. I refused to move. The view of the water, always moving, always reflecting, reminded me where I'd begun, the steady current that had carried me forward through every decision. My hair had a few strands of silver now. I didn't hide them. They felt like medals, proof of survival, proof of growth. My mornings were quiet, spent with coffee and solitude. My evenings filled with work that no longer felt like penance but purpose. There was peace now, the kind that comes when you no longer need to win, no longer need to prove, no longer need to punish. But peace doesn't mean the story ends. It means you learn how to live between the chapters. One spring afternoon, as I reviewed a new initiative proposal, my assistant knocked gently on the door. "There's someone asking for you," she said. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says he knows you." I looked up. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "Ethan Grayson." For a moment the air felt heavier, not with dread, but with the quiet recognition that even time sometimes circles back to test what it healed. I nodded. "Send him in." When he walked through the door, I barely recognized him. His confidence was gone, replaced by something humbler, quieter. The sharpness around his eyes had softened. He looked like a man who had lived long enough to understand regret. We shook hands, no anger, no nostalgia. Just two people acknowledging that they had once shared a story, and that story was over. He said he'd come to thank me. Not for forgiveness, but for the consequences. Losing everything, he said, had been the beginning of his real life. He'd started a small construction firm, modest, honest, built from scratch. "You taught me what integrity costs," he said softly. "And I learned to pay it." I listened. Not out of obligation, but because I no longer felt the need to interrupt. I could hear the sincerity in his voice. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or even vindication. I just felt free. He handed me a small folder, a portfolio of one of his company's new projects. Affordable housing developments for single parents, built on ethical financing. "I wanted to do something right," he said. "Something that builds instead of takes." I opened the folder and looked at the designs. They were simple, practical, real. There was a strange beauty in their honesty. "You've done well," I said finally. And I meant it. He smiled faintly. "You were always better at seeing what mattered." When he left, I stood by the window, watching as he crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd. No grand emotion followed, no cinematic ending, just quiet finality. Closure doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I walked along the riverbank, the same path I had taken countless times over the years. The air smelled faintly of rain and new beginnings. Couples passed me, laughing, holding hands, children chasing each other near the water's edge. I wasn't lonely. I was alone, yes, but solitude and loneliness are not the same. Solitude is chosen. Loneliness is imposed. I had chosen this, the space, the silence, the freedom to define what happiness meant on my own terms. And then, as I turned the corner, I saw him. Not Ethan, someone new. A man sitting on a bench, sketching the skyline in a worn notebook. His face was unfamiliar, his expression focused and calm. Our eyes met briefly, a polite accidental acknowledgement between two strangers sharing a moment of stillness. He smiled, I nodded, and we both returned to our own worlds. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't fate. It was simply possibility, and that was enough. I realized, as I stood there watching the water shimmer under the last light, that this was what healing truly looked like. Not the absence of memory, but the presence of peace. Not needing the story to change, but finally being able to live beyond it. I had lost love. I had lost innocence. I had lost the illusion that safety comes from someone else's promise. But in losing all of that, I had found myself, not the fragile version molded by someone else's approval, but the woman forged in the quiet aftermath of betrayal. I had found purpose. I had found strength. I had found peace. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of the river, I heard the truth that had taken me years to understand. You don't rebuild by erasing the past. You rebuild by outgrowing it. As the city lights flickered to life and night settled softly around me, I turned away from the water and walked home, not toward revenge, not toward redemption, but toward the life I had finally chosen, freely and fully. Everything I lost had brought me here. And here I had found everything.